Hello, welcome to the Self-Learning Platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 28, Communitarianism and Civic Republicanism. And we start with topic the idea of Republican government. Based on the Republican idea of freedom as non-domination is the idea of freedom as non-domination as Republican believe would be achieved only when each citizen feels that he or she is not being ruled or dominated by the power of others, but by his or her own interest. As such, Republican freedom is the desire not to rule, but rather not to be ruled. This Republican belief necessitates a different and a more inclusive idea of government. Below, we examine the idea of a Republican government. Underlying the idea of Republican government are the principles of civic virtue, the idea of common good, and the notion of active civic participation. The Republican idea of civic virtue may be understood as the willingness to set the common good above one's own or family's interest. In fact, the idea of citizens being virtuous is an integral part of the tradition of civic republicanism. Civic republicanism, in a similar vein with communitarian, requires that we as citizens place the common good above our particular individual interest. For it is only by placing the common good, the good of all, above our private interest, that we would guarantee and realize the value of freedom as non domination. Republicans emphatically claim that without civic virtue, the republic will degenerate into a battlefield of rival interests. With the Republican doctrine lays great stress on the fundamental importance of civic virtue. It lays equal stress on the fragility of virtue, the danger that a people or its leaders would become corrupt, thereby threatening the republic. Civic republicans are cautious of the state officials exercising power in an arbitrary way, thereby denying republican freedom. How then can the state and its officials be prevented from exercising power in an arbitrary way? Republicans also recognize that people do not make up a perfectly harmonious or homogeneous body with identical interests. Rather, they are divided on the basis of interest. Such division of interest could translate into a major threat to both civic virtue and the republic. How then should a republic be organized so as to reconcile the different conflicting interests in society? It is to guard against such threats to the republic that civic republicanism advocates a number of measures, the first important of which is active civic participation. Active civil participation, Republicans argue, is essentially the price of liberty, the tool with which citizens can replace an eternal vigilance on the government and its officials. Active participation ensures that a powerful group or citizen does not dominate or violate the freedom of others by taking control of government. In fact, active civic participation is understood to be a prerequisite and a condition for the guarantee of Republican freedom. The Republican idea of citizenship, however, ought to be contrasted with the liberal idea of citizenship. While the latter regards citizenship as a right passively enjoyed by citizens who desire freedom from external restraints, the former identified citizenship with those rights which empower citizens with the freedom to actively engage with other citizens under conditions and in pursuance of freedom and equality. Citizenship, in the Republican view, is an office and a responsibility that is proudly assumed by citizens. To be a citizen in a republic is to be a self governing member of a self governing community. In addition to civic participation, civic republicanism argues in favor of constitutionalism as a measure to guard against threats to republican virtues. The task of civic republicanism is to design a constitution that would reflect and balance the diverse interests in society. The British Constitution is often cited as an example of such a balance, wherein the interest of one, the monarch, the few, the aristocracy, and the many, the common people, are balanced in the mixed government of Crown, the House of Lords, and House of Commons. The idea of separation of power among legislature, the executive, and the judiciary is also identified as an equally important guard. According to Republican theorists, the concentration of powers in the hands of one person or group is the most potent source of domination and subjugation of others. The advocacy of the ideas of civic virtue, common good, active civic citizenship, mixed constitutions, and separation of powers make up an important, if not the core of idea of republican government. Understandably then, civic republicanism is seen to be complementary, if not in support of the idea of democracy. It is with these ideas of government as well as with the idea of freedom as non-domination that Republicans aim at replacing the empire of men with the empire of laws. Now, summary of the unit. In the sections above, we have examined separately, though, two important perspectives in contemporary political theory, namely Communitarianism, and Civic Republicanism. In this section, and by way of concluding this unit, we make a comparative assessment of these perspectives by highlighting the ideas on which they complement and differ from each other. We also attempt to bring out some of the strengths and weaknesses of these two perspectives. To begin with, we look at the points of complementarity between these two perspectives. As mentioned above, both communitarianism and civic republicanism contain forceful critiques and compelling alternatives to the ideas of liberal individualism. Firstly, they both begin by characterizing humans as social and political animals who, in order to realize their interests and lead good lives, ought to live in association with one another. Secondly, both perspectives criticize the liberal individualistic conception of self as a self detached and disembodied from its ends, while for the communitarian this conception is unreal. The Republicans see it too undesirable for the establishment of a good and free polity. Thirdly, both endow the state with a positive rather than a negative role. In fact, a just state, according to both perspectives, rather than being neutral, is one that protects and promotes the common good. Finally, both communitarianism and civic republicanism see the community and cultural membership as playing an important role in determining the choices that we make in the public sphere. While communitarianism are more candid about the centrality of community membership to individual choices, civic republican make a more subtle statement when they advocate the idea of freedom as non-domination. An important difference between these two perspectives is that while the communitarian reject the possibility of a neutral state, civic republicanism advocates the possibility of a state which transcends religious and other related divides. Indeed, both communitarianism and civic republicanism make equal, although somewhat different, important and compelling contributions to political theory. Some of such contributions are the communitarian understanding of the relationship between the person and the community, the importance of community membership and values in the determination of people's choices, the critique of the idea of state neutrality, the Republican idea of freedom as non domination, the nuanced understanding of the relationship between domination and interference, and the emphasis on civic virtue and participation. While the communitarian and civic republican perspective are recognized for the contributions they make to contemporary political theory, they have been criticized by both political theorists, particularly liberal individualists. According to these political theorists, by prioritizing community membership, communitarians undervalue the importance of individual rights and autonomy. In fact, they leave the individual a hostage to the will and good of the community, which could and often does reduce the space of individual freedom and choice. The idea of a common good is criticized on the grounds that such a good is difficult to determine in societies that are characterized by deep pluralism. In fact, if determined, the idea of common good can have conservative and repressive connotations, mainly because it would provide a standard from which individual conception of good would be judged and thereby advanced or eliminated. Both these perspectives therefore fail to see and guard against the possibility of the common good becoming a proprietor of domination and injustice. To conclude, it may be appropriate to say that for us in India, an understanding of the communitarian and civic republican perspective is relevant in terms of both political theory and political practice. On one hand, we need to understand and assess the different contributions made by these perspectives in their critique of liberal individualism as well as of the alternative principles they advocate. On the other hand, we need to relate these contributions and alternative principles to our present political practices. Here we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention, and we have come to the end of the unit.